Stop believing the myth of the madman. You have been sold a caricature of Fidel Castro as an impulsive, chaotic revolutionary who operated purely on rage and anti-American sentiment. The history books tell you he was obsessed with dismantling Yankee imperialism, that he was willing to incinerate the world during the missile crisis just to prove a point. If that were true, if he really was the unhinged aggressor the Western media portrayed, then explain the anomaly. Explain the 45 square miles of sovereign Cuban soil that he allowed the United States military to occupy every single day of his 49-year reign. Explain why the man who nationalized American sugar mills, seized American oil refineries, and expelled the American mafia stopped his tanks exactly at the fence line of Guantanamo Bay. He didn't fire a shot. He didn't storm the gates. He didn't break the treaty. You think it was fear? You think the revolutionary who defied 10 U.S. presidents was scared of a naval skirmish? Wrong. It wasn't fear, and it wasn't respect for international law. It was the coldest, most calculated act of geopolitical restraint in the 20th century. Castro understood something his enemies didn't. Sometimes the most damaging weapon you can wield against a superpower isn't a missile. It's a landlord's lease that you refuse to honor. You're watching Power Explained, where silence is a weapon. If you value dissecting the hidden mechanics of history, subscribing ensures you don't miss the next investigation. To understand this paralyzed standoff, you have to look at the map through the eyes of a dictator obsessed with sovereignty. Guantanamo Bay sits on the southeastern edge of Cuba, a strategic deep-water harbor that controls the Windward Passage, the maritime choke point between Cuba and Haiti. For a leader like Castro, whose entire political identity was built on the concept of patria o muerte, homeland or death, the existence of this base was not just a military threat. It was a humiliating, festering wound. It was a foreign flag planted in the flesh of his revolution. Every morning, the sun rose over Cuban hills to illuminate American radar towers. Every evening, the sound of U.S. naval drills drifted into Cuban towns. It was a daily, visceral reminder that the revolution was incomplete. And yet, the tanks never rolled. The artillery never fired. The silence at that fence line is the loudest paradox in Cold War history. Most people assume the base remained because the United States simply bullied Cuba into submission with superior firepower. While the threat of annihilation was real, power analysis tells us that brute force is rarely the only variable. The restraint was mutual, born from a legal stranglehold that predated Castro by half a century. We have to go back to the source of the humiliation, to the document that acted as the invisible cage. The year was 1903. The United States had just helped expel the Spanish Empire from Cuba, but as is often the case in geopolitics, the liberator became the new warden. The U.S. forced the inclusion of the Platt Amendment into the Cuban Constitution, essentially granting Washington the right to intervene in Cuban affairs whenever it saw fit. From this diplomatic strong-arming came the lease of lands for coaling and naval stations. This is the document that tied Castro's hands decades before he was even born. The terms were draconian. The United States was granted complete jurisdiction and control over the area of Guantanamo Bay, while recognizing Cuba's ultimate sovereignty. It is a masterpiece of legal fiction. Cuba owns the land, but the U.S. rules it. But the true genius of the trap lay in the termination clause. The lease had no expiration date. It could only be voided by the abandonment of the area by the United States or by the mutual consent of both governments. Mutual consent. That two-word phrase is the lock on the gate. It meant that no matter how much Castro screamed, no matter how many speeches he gave at the United Nations denouncing the base as a dagger plunged into the heart of Cuban soil, he had no legal mechanism to evict the tenant. The United States had to agree to leave. And in the zero-sum game of the Cold War, the United States was never going to agree to surrender a strategic foothold 90 miles from Florida. So, Castro found himself in a geopolitical vice. If he attacked the base militarily, he gave the United States the casus belli, the justification for war, that the Pentagon hawks were desperate for. An attack on Guantanamo would not be treated as a border dispute. It would be treated as an act of war against American soil, triggering a full-scale invasion that would topple his regime in days. But if he did nothing, he looked weak. He looked like a hypocrite preaching revolution while tolerating occupation. This is where the narrative usually stops, with Castro checkmated by a piece of paper and a fleet of destroyers. But power is not just about what you can do. It is about how you frame what you cannot do. Castro realized that if he couldn't remove the base, he had to weaponize its presence. He had to turn the symbol of American strength into a symbol of American arrogance. The transition began immediately after the revolution in 1959. As the bearded guerrillas descended from the Sierra Maestra Mountains and took Havana, the world held its breath, expecting the momentum to carry them right through the gates of the naval base. The tension was palpable. The U.S. Marines on the inside reinforced the perimeter, laying thousands of landmines, creating one of the largest minefields in the world. They built watchtowers and patrolled the fence line with dogs, waiting for the inevitable human wave attack. On the other side, the Cuban Frontier Brigade dug in, planting their own gardens of explosives and pointing their artillery at the barracks. It was the Iron Curtain in miniature, a few thousand yards of scrubland separating two nuclear-armed ideologies. But the attack never came. Instead, Castro engaged in a theater of rejection. The lease agreement stipulated that the United States would pay Cuba 2,000 gold coins per year in rent, an amount later adjusted to roughly $4,085 annually. It was a pittance, an insulting sum for 45 square miles of prime territory. In the early days of the revolution, the U.S. Treasury, adhering strictly to the letter of the law, sent the check. Castro received it, and in a moment that defines his understanding of symbolic power, he refused to cash it. He didn't burn it. He didn't send it back. He shoved it into a desk drawer. The next year, another check arrived. Into the drawer. Year after year, the United States government dutifully sent a check for $4,085. And year after year, Castro let them pile up, uncashed, collecting dust in a dark office in Havana. Why? Because cashing the check would mean accepting the legitimacy of the lease. It would mean he was a landlord accepting rent, a complicit partner in the occupation of his own country. By refusing the money, he transformed the United States from a tenant into a squatter. He stripped the transaction of its legality in the eyes of his people. He could stand on a podium and honestly say that Cuba accepted nothing from the imperialists. The uncashed checks became a prop in his narrative of resistance. He was telling the world that Cuban dignity was not for sale, not for $4,000, not for $4 billion. This was the beginning of the strategy of contained hostility. Castro began to test the boundaries of the cage, probing to see how much he could annoy the giant without waking it up. He cut off the water supply to the base in 1964, forcing the U.S. to import water from Jamaica and eventually build its own desalination plant. He forbade Cubans from working on the base, slowly choking off the local labor supply that the Americans had relied on for decades. He turned the perimeter into a psychological war zone, blasting revolutionary propaganda through loudspeakers aimed at the Marine barracks, day and night. He was creating a pressure cooker, but he was careful never to let the lid blow off. He needed the base to remain a visible enemy. As long as the stars and stripes flew over Guantanamo, he had a permanent, tangible villain to point to. When the Cuban economy faltered, he could point to the base. When dissent rose, he could point to the base. It became the ultimate external threat that justified his internal authoritarianism. He didn't touch Guantanamo because Guantanamo was useful. It was the anchor that held his anti-American rhetoric in place. However, to truly appreciate the discipline required for this inaction, we must look at the moments when the restraint nearly broke. There were incidents, forgotten by the public but etched into military logs, where the trigger was almost pulled. Fishermen straying too close, Marines throwing rocks across the fence, Cuban guards racking their rifles. In these micro-moments of friction, the fate of the island hung in the balance. Castro's command to his troops was absolute and paradoxical. Display maximum aggression, but under no circumstances, not even if fired upon, were they to initiate a combat engagement that could be interpreted as an invasion. He demanded they stand nose to nose with the enemy and do absolutely nothing. This was not passivity. This was the discipline of a man who knew that the first person to flinch would lose the war, but the first person to shoot would lose the country. But let's strip away the romanticism of the revolutionary hero. This wasn't just discipline. It was a humiliating, grinding reality that Castro had to swallow every single morning. Imagine waking up as the supreme leader of a liberated nation, walking to your window, and seeing the flag of your mortal enemy flying over your own soil. It is a geopolitical slap in the face that never stops stinging. For any other leader, in any other context, this visual insult would be grounds for immediate, irrational war. But Castro did something terrifyingly rational. He realized that the base was more valuable to him as a hostage than as a conquest. To understand why he didn't attack, you have to look at the board the way he did. In the early 1960s, Guantanamo Bay wasn't just a naval station. It was a tripwire. The Americans knew it and Castro knew it. The base was geographically vulnerable, surrounded by hostile hills, easily targeted by Cuban artillery. Militarily, the Cuban Revolutionary Armed Forces could have likely overrun the perimeter in a matter of hours during the early days. But that tactical victory would have triggered a strategic annihilation. The moment a Cuban boot crossed that fence line, Article 51 of the UN Charter, the right to self-defense, would have given the United States a legal, internationally recognized mandate to invade the entire island. Castro wasn't staring at a military base, he was staring at a trap. He saw the bait and he refused to take it. Instead, he initiated a strategy of aggressive containment. He couldn't remove the tumor, so he decided to isolate it. This is where the narrative shifts from military history to psychological warfare. Castro ordered the construction of what became known as the cactus curtain. His engineers planted an 8-mile barrier of Opuntia cactus along the northeastern border of the base. It was a primitive, organic wall, later reinforced by minefields and guard towers. The official line from Havana was that this barrier was necessary to stop American aggression and prevent CIA saboteurs from infiltrating Cuba. But the unspoken reality was far more cynical. The cactus curtain wasn't just there to keep Americans out. It was there to keep Cubans in. It prevented asylum seekers from rushing the American gates, which would have created a humanitarian crisis the U.S. could use as leverage. By sealing the border, Castro effectively turned the base into an island within an island, neutralizing its ability to destabilize his population. The tension of the standoff reached its absolute breaking point in February 1964. If there was ever a moment where the Cold War was about to turn hot over this patch of scrubland, this was it. The catalyst was a dispute over fishing rights. The U.S. Coast Guard had detained 4 Cuban fishing boats off the coast of Florida, fining the captains for fishing in U.S. waters. It was a minor diplomatic spat, the kind that usually results in a strongly worded letter. Castro, however, saw an opening to test the boundaries of his containment strategy. He didn't fire a shot. He didn't mobilize the tanks. He simply reached for the utility bill. On February 6, 1964, Castro cut off the fresh water supply to Guantanamo Bay. It was a masterstroke of logistical strangulation. The base relied entirely on water pumped from the Yatares River, located deep in Cuban territory. By turning the valve, Castro was forcing the Americans to choose between humiliation, importing water by ship, or escalation. He was betting that President Lyndon B. Johnson, already preoccupied with the escalating situation in Vietnam, would not start a war over a dry faucet. It was a calculated probe of American resolve. If you enjoy analyzing these moments where logistics and willpower collide to shape history, a like on this video helps support more of these deep dive investigations. The American response was swift and surprisingly industrial. Instead of retaliating with force, Admiral John Bulkeley, the base commander, ordered the immediate installation of desalination plants. The U.S. Navy began making its own water. But Bulkeley went a step further in the psychological game. To prove that the base was self-sufficient and to mock Castro's attempt at a siege, Bulkeley ordered the water pipes coming from the Cuban side to be cut. He didn't just cap them. He physically severed them and removed a section of the pipe, holding it up for the press to see. This was the countermove. Castro had tried to use dependency as a weapon, and the U.S. responded by eliminating the dependency entirely. While this might look like a tactical loss for Castro, he lost his leverage over the base's utilities. It solidified the narrative he wanted to sell to his people. The cutting of the water and the subsequent severance of the pipes marked the final physical separation of the two powers. It allowed Castro to stand on a podium in Havana and declare that the imperialists were stealing Cuban land, but they could no longer steal Cuban water. He spun a logistical failure into a moral victory. But there was a darker, heavier shadow looming over Castro's inaction, one that often gets ignored in the biographies of the man. We have to talk about the Soviet leash. We like to imagine dictators as having absolute agency, but Castro was operating within a strict hierarchy of global communism. After the Cuban Missile Crisis of 1962, the Soviet Union was terrified of another accidental confrontation. Khrushchev had already blinked once. He wasn't eager to do it again over a naval station that held zero strategic value for Moscow. Declassified documents from the era reveal a constant stream of pressure from the Kremlin. The Soviets were bankrolling the Cuban Revolution. They were keeping the lights on in Havana. And the one condition of that patronage was stability in the Caribbean. If Castro had moved on Guantanamo, he wouldn't just be fighting the Americans, he would be defying his paymasters. The Soviets viewed Guantanamo not as a threat, but as a safety valve. As long as the Americans felt secure in their little enclave, they were less likely to launch a full-scale invasion of the island. Castro was effectively ordered to tolerate the intolerable. He was a revolutionary lion in a cage built by his enemies and locked by his friends. This brings us to the most fascinating aspect of his restraint: the legalistic trolling of the United States. Since the revolution, the United States has dutifully sent a treasury check every year to the Cuban government for the lease of the base, roughly $4,085 annually, a price set in 1934. It is a pittance, a joke, but the payment is legally required to maintain the lease. Castro's handling of these checks is a perfect study in symbolic dominance. He didn't return them. He didn't burn them. He stuffed them in a desk drawer. Legend has it that in the early chaos of the revolution, one check was cashed by mistake by an overzealous clerk, a bureaucratic error that Castro reportedly raged about for years. But every subsequent check was simply ignored. By refusing to cash the checks, Castro was legally arguing that the lease was invalid. In contract law, if you accept payment, you accept the terms. By letting the checks rot in a drawer, he was maintaining a permanent state of legal protest. He was saying, "I am not your landlord. You are squatters." This refusal served a dual purpose. Domestically, it proved he couldn't be bought. Internationally, it kept the legal status of the base in a gray zone. If he had cashed the checks, he would have normalized the American presence. By ignoring them, he kept the wound open. And keeping the wound open was essential for his survival. This is the uncomfortable truth about dictatorships that rely on an external enemy. They need the enemy to stay close. If the Americans had packed up and left Guantanamo Bay in 1965, if they had lowered the flag and sailed away, Castro would have lost his greatest propaganda asset. The base was a visible, tangible villain. Whenever the Cuban economy faltered, whenever the harvest failed, whenever dissent began to bubble up in the streets of Havana, Castro could point east. He could point to the Marines on the fence line and say, "We are under siege. We must sacrifice. We must be vigilant." Guantanamo Bay allowed Castro to maintain a permanent war footing without actually fighting a war. It justified the militarization of Cuban society. It justified the suppression of civil liberties. It justified the economic hardships. The base was the ultimate scapegoat, conveniently located right on the island. In a twisted way, Castro didn't touch Guantanamo because Guantanamo was working for him. The Americans were providing the security services for his own narrative. However, this passive-aggressive stalemate wasn't static. It evolved. As the Cold War dragged on, the base shifted from a military outpost to something far more complex, a detention center for refugees and later for enemy combatants. And with every shift, Castro's strategy of inaction had to adapt. He had to watch as the base transformed from a symbol of imperialism into a global controversy of its own, all while his soldiers stood watch, under strict orders to never, ever engage. But there is a difference between ignoring a neighbor and ignoring a loaded gun pointed at your head. As the decades passed, the technology of warfare changed. The strategic value of the Caribbean changed. And the man in Havana began to realize that his inaction was no longer just a choice. It was becoming the only card he had left to play. To understand how this standoff survived the fall of the Berlin Wall and the collapse of the Soviet Union, we have to look at the transition of power. Because when the world changed, the base didn't. And that stagnation became the most dangerous phase of all. Stop believing the lie that the collapse of the Soviet Union ended the danger. That is the comfortable narrative we tell ourselves to tidy up history books. But on the ground, the reality was far more volatile. When the Soviet subsidies vanished, the geopolitical chessboard didn't clear. It caught fire. You might assume that a starving, isolated Cuba would finally collapse, or that the United States, now the unchecked global hegemon, would simply walk in and reclaim the land it had leased for a century. But neither of those things happened. Instead, the silence grew louder. The inaction became more aggressive. If you think doing nothing is a sign of weakness, you are missing the most ruthless strategy in the dictator's playbook. Inaction, when weaponized correctly, is not a retreat, it is a trap. The early 1990s in Cuba were defined by the special period, a euphemism for a devastating economic implosion. Without Soviet oil, the tractors stopped. Without Soviet grain, the caloric intake of the average citizen plummeted. The island was plunged into literal darkness, with blackouts lasting 18 hours a day. And yet, amidst this total systemic failure, the lights of Guantanamo Bay burned brightly on the horizon, powered by American generators, fueled by American supply lines, a shining city of surplus mocking the starving nation just beyond the fence. This visual contrast should have been the breaking point. Logic dictates that a desperate leader in Castro's position would manufacture a crisis to rally his people, perhaps a skirmish at the fence to justify the misery. Or, conversely, that the population, seeing the proximity of American wealth, would storm the gates not to fight, but to escape. But Castro did something far more sophisticated. He realized that the base was no longer a military threat. It was now his most valuable domestic asset. He needed a villain. When the economy is collapsing because your patron state has disintegrated, you cannot blame your own ideology without risking revolution. You need an external enemy to explain why the shelves are empty. Guantanamo Bay became the physical manifestation of that enemy. Castro didn't touch the base because he needed it to remain exactly where it was, a visible, tangible scar of imperialist aggression. Every blackout could be framed not as a failure of central planning, but as a consequence of the blockade enforced by the occupiers next door. He transformed the base from a strategic liability into a rhetorical gold mine. This is where the famous legend of the rent checks becomes a critical piece of geopolitical theater. Since the revolution, the United States had dutifully sent a treasury check every year for the lease of the bay, a paltry sum of roughly $4,000, based on the valuation from 1903. For decades, the narrative has been that Castro simply threw them away. But the reality is more calculated. He kept them. He stuffed them into a desk drawer in his office year after year, letting them gather dust. This wasn't just pettiness. It was a display of sovereign rejection. By refusing to cash the checks, he refused to legitimize the contract. If he had taken the money, he would have been a landlord accepting rent, implicitly agreeing to the tenant's right to be there. By letting the checks rot, he maintained the stance that the U.S. was an illegal squatter. It was a masterclass in symbolic dominance. He couldn't force the Marines out with guns, so he invalidated their presence with paper. He denied them the moral authority of a contract, leaving them in a state of permanent, awkward illegitimacy. However, symbolism doesn't feed a population. By 1994, the pressure cooker of the special period was about to explode, and this is where the strategy of inaction shifted into a strategy of demographic warfare. The tension on the streets of Havana was becoming unmanageable. Riots were beginning to form. The regime needed a pressure valve, and Castro looked at the heavily fortified border of Guantanamo and saw an opportunity to flip the script entirely. For 30 years, the Cuban military had guarded the perimeter to keep people in. The Cactus Curtain, an 8-mile barrier of cactus and minefields, was designed to stop defections. But in August of 1994, Castro simply ordered his guards to stand down. He told the United States, effectively, "If you want to be the beacon of freedom, you can have them." He stopped policing the border. He stopped patrolling the beaches. He unleashed the Balsero crisis. Tens of thousands of Cubans took to the sea on makeshift rafts, and thousands more headed toward the base. This was a brilliant inversion of power. The United States military is designed to fight armies, to intercept missiles, to secure territory. It is not designed to handle a sudden influx of 30,000 desperate civilians wading through the surf. Castro turned the U.S. naval base into a refugee camp overnight. The inaction of the Cuban military forced the action of the American military. The Pentagon was suddenly overwhelmed not by enemy fire, but by logistics. They had to feed, house, and process thousands of people on a base that was meant for naval operations. The sheer chaotic volume of humanity neutralized the base's military utility. You cannot launch airstrikes or coordinate fleet maneuvers when your runways are covered in tents and your soldiers are distributing MREs. If analyzing these moments of strategic paralysis helps you see the hidden mechanics behind global power, your support on this channel allows us to keep digging into the archives. This crisis revealed the new reality of the post-Cold War world. The threat was no longer nuclear annihilation. It was migration. Castro proved that he could destabilize a U.S. presidency not with a missile silo, but by simply opening the door. The Clinton administration was terrified of the political fallout of a migration crisis. They were paralyzed by the optics of turning refugees away, yet incapable of absorbing them all. Washington was forced to the negotiating table. The resulting talks changed the nature of the base forever. The U.S. agreed to take a minimum of 20,000 Cuban immigrants annually in a legal, orderly fashion, effectively agreeing to act as a pressure release valve for the Cuban regime, just to stop the chaotic flow. The base, in a strange twist of irony, became a collaborative tool. The U.S. military and the Cuban military, technically enemies, began to coordinate. They established direct hotlines. The commanders on both sides of the fence started meeting regularly, not to threaten each other, but to manage the fence line. The inaction had evolved into a frozen cooperation. The base was no longer a dagger pointed at the heart of Cuba. It was a shared burden. This period of the mid-90s solidified the stalemate. Castro had successfully neutralized the base as a vector for invasion. He had proven that any attempt by the U.S. to use the base aggressively would be met with a demographic bomb that the U.S. political system could not handle. And the United States, realizing that the cost of removing Castro was too high and the utility of the base was shifting, settled into a comfortable inertia. But just as this equilibrium seemed permanent, the world shifted again. As the 90s bled into the new millennium, the strategic purpose of Guantanamo Bay was about to undergo its darkest transformation yet. The base was sitting there, a legal anomaly, outside the jurisdiction of U.S. federal courts, yet under total U.S. control. It was a black hole of sovereignty. And when the towers fell in New York in 2001, the Bush administration didn't look at Guantanamo as a naval station or a refugee camp. They looked at it and saw the perfect place to hide people. The very thing that had irritated Castro, the base's murky legal status, suddenly became its primary selling point for the Pentagon. The inaction of the previous decade had preserved a legal vacuum, a space where the Constitution didn't quite apply, and that vacuum was about to be filled with something far more controversial than naval ships. Castro's strategy of containment had worked to protect his regime, but he had inadvertently preserved a facility that was about to become the center of a new, global controversy, one that had nothing to do with Cuba at all. You might think the arrival of orange jumpsuits and barbed wire in January 2002 was the moment Castro finally lost patience. You would be wrong. The world expected a showdown, a demand for sovereignty, perhaps even a military mobilization to protect Cuban soil from becoming a global dungeon. But that assumption misunderstands the ruthless pragmatism of Fidel Castro. He didn't see a prison. He saw a gift. While the global media screamed about human rights and legal black holes, Castro saw the United States voluntarily walking into a trap he hadn't even needed to set. The Americans were about to turn his greatest humiliation into his greatest propaganda victory, and all he had to do was stand back and watch them do it. This is where the genius of inaction truly reveals itself. When the first transport planes touched down carrying detainees from Afghanistan, the dynamic of the base shifted fundamentally. For decades, Guantanamo had been a symbol of American military might, a clean, disciplined projection of naval power. But almost overnight, It transformed into something darker, something murky and controversial. The Bush administration selected Guantanamo precisely because of that peculiar lease Castro despised. It was the perfect legal twilight zone, under the ultimate control of the United States, yet not technically part of it. This meant that U.S. courts had no jurisdiction, and the U.S. Constitution stopped at the waterline. Castro understood this legal gymnastics immediately, but instead of railing against the imperialist occupation, he did something that baffled observers. He offered help. In the early days of Camp X-Ray, the Cuban government publicly offered medical supplies and assistance to the American forces. They promised not to interfere with the transport flights. They didn't jam the communications. They stepped aside. Why? Because Castro realized that by facilitating the base's operation, he was legitimizing his own narrative. For 40 years, he had told his people that the United States was an oppressive empire that cared nothing for international law. Now, the United States was broadcasting images of men in cages, kneeling in the tropical sun, held without trial on Cuban soil. He didn't need to print posters or give speeches to prove his point anymore. The Americans were broadcasting the proof on CNN 24 hours a day. This period marked the ultimate validation of his containment strategy. Had he attacked the base in the 1960s, he would have been the aggressor. Had he cut the water in the 1970s, he would have been the villain. But by waiting, by enduring the presence of the base until the geopolitical winds shifted, he allowed the base to become a liability for Washington. The legal vacuum that the Pentagon coveted became a heavy diplomatic chain. Every report of torture, every hunger strike, every legal challenge that emerged from Guantanamo damaged American soft power in Latin America and the world. Castro's inaction allowed the United States to inflict that damage upon itself. If you are beginning to see how strategic patience often outlasts brute force in high-stakes geopolitics, subscribing to the channel ensures you won't miss our upcoming deep dives into the hidden mechanics of power. As the years ground on, the utility of the base for the United States began to degrade, but the lease remained ironclad. The check that Castro famously kept in his desk drawer, the annual rent of roughly $4,000, became a potent symbol. By refusing to cash the checks, he maintained the stance that the lease was illegitimate, yet by refusing to physically challenge the lease, he respected the reality of American force. It was a dual existence, ideological rejection coupled with physical compliance. This stalemate survived the transition of power to his brother, Raul Castro, and eventually the death of Fidel himself. When the Obama administration moved to normalize relations, opening embassies and easing travel restrictions, the issue of Guantanamo sat in the room like an unexploded ordnance. President Obama wanted to close the detention center, admitting it was a stain on American honor, but he had no intention of returning the land. The strategic value of a deep-water port in the Caribbean, regardless of the prison, remained too high for the Pentagon to surrender. This brings us to the modern reality of the base. The cactus curtain has largely been dismantled, replaced by motion sensors and standard fencing, but the divide is as absolute as ever. The base has become a self-sufficient island, producing its own water and electricity, completely severed from the Cuban grid. It is a fortress of solitude, disconnected from the very land it occupies. So why didn't Castro touch Guantanamo Bay? The answer isn't fear. It isn't weakness. It is the calculated understanding that some battles are won by refusing to fight them. Castro recognized that the base was a trap. Attacking it would have triggered Article 51 of the UN Charter, giving the United States a legal justification for a full-scale invasion, the very thing the Bay of Pigs failed to achieve. By isolating the base, by turning his back on it, he denied the U.S. that justification. He turned a military threat into a political tool. He used the base to unify his people, pointing to the fence line as daily proof of the external enemy, justifying his internal crackdowns and economic failures as necessary measures against a besieging empire. The base served Castro better as a hostage than it would have as a conquest. As long as the Americans were there, the revolution had a visible enemy. The occupation justified the perpetual state of emergency that kept the regime in power. In a twisted irony, the survival of the Castro regime depended in part on the survival of the American base. It was the necessary friction that kept the revolutionary fire burning. Today, the base remains. The detainees are fewer, the headlines are quieter, but the fence stands. It is a monument to a Cold War that officially ended decades ago but continues to breathe in this corner of the Caribbean. It stands as a testament to the power of constraint. In the game of nations, we are often taught that power is about expansion, taking territory, asserting dominance, moving forward. But the story of Guantanamo teaches the opposite lesson. Sometimes power is the discipline to stand still. Sometimes the most dangerous move you can make against an opponent is to let them keep exactly what they want and wait for the weight of it to drag them down. Castro didn't touch Guantanamo because he didn't have to. He understood that in the long arc of history, the intruder is always the one who looks out of place. He simply waited for the rest of the world to notice. And in the end, he died in his own bed, in his own capital, while the flag of his enemy still waved over a small, isolated patch of dirt that had caused them nothing but trouble for half a century. He didn't win the territory, but he won the argument. And in the world of geopolitical dominance, that is often the only victory that matters.